Right. So let's see. I think we have everyone here. I think people are coming in here. Okay. All right. So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me this morning for our AMA. And one sec while I. Okay. So let me just sorry, I'm just getting my bearings here as more and more people trickle in here, just wanting to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay, so let me also let me see. There we go. Okay, I knew I was supposed to say something there. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. And for all of those of you who don't know me, my name is Garrett Vitanza, and I am the principal instructor at the Academy of Realist Art, Boston. I'm happy to be here today to be answering your questions this morning. I'm actually coming into you from Western Massachusetts. I'm actually was at the Clark the last couple of days doing some research and taking a lot of photos and videos. And for those of you who are in the state, just to let you know, the Clark is actually free admission throughout the whole month of March. I think it's because they're doing a lot of reconstruction on the campus. So if you are in Massachusetts, that is something that you probably should check out. It's free all March long for some reason, which is great. And if you haven't yet, I do also highly encourage that you do go. It has I think it has the only or one of the very few. I'm getting my facts wrong. It has one of the very few, I believe. Piero. Oh, I was just looking at this name this morning. I want to say Piero della Francesca, I think, although I could be getting that wrong. I always get even though I'm Sicilian, the Italian names I always butcher and get wrong, and I confuse them I call it Perugino, Giorgione all the time. It's really embarrassing to my heritage. So as we start off here, if anybody has any questions please go ahead and put those in the chat. And then as you guys go type those in, I can then give you, I'll just call out your name and you can unmute yourself at that point, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion. So one of the things that I also tend to wanted to mention that I talk about a lot kind of in my own critiques when I'm talking to students quite a bit is I always tend to kind of work in a bit of art history and kind of zooming out a little bit, just seeing how kind of some of the bigger kind of movements in art and how those have kind of affected things even kind of in a minor way. Because sometimes I just remember being a student and asking myself, well, why am I, sometimes you do kind of, find yourself kind of, just asking yourself, why am I doing this? And then sometimes when you do have that kind of encouragement and refresher that there is actually a it's actually, there is a very specific reason for that. And it actually does, does actually matter, and it does pay off. That actually often happens in our drawing program when students are really tasked with filling in the holes. For those of you who aren't aware, when you are doing graphite drawings in the academic process, there's a stage in which you are looking to effectively hide all of your tool marks and pencil marks. So you're effectively really not really for aesthetic reasons. Actually, funnily enough, this is really just to ensure that your values and that your forms are at the highest kind of illusions possible. And so sorry, excuse me, my father was just texting me, good luck today. But anyway, yeah, so getting back on track. If anybody does have any questions, sorry, one sec here. So Lori, I really want to pronounce this full name correctly. Lori Del Geni.
I'm Italian too. You're gonna butcher my name, aren't you? It's Del Genis. Del Genis. It's short for Del Genio.
Del Genio. Okay.
yeah, my, hello, hold on. Hello, there I am. My grandfather came from Genoa. He was Genoese. So he came over on the boat and they asked who he was, and he said Giuseppe, and they said, Giuseppe what? He said, Del Genio. I came from Genoa.
Mhm.
So that's what they put down.
Yeah, my great grandmother, God rest her soul, she, very, very much like the kind of godfather, came over to America in the early 1930s, and she,
Right.
the man that got her pregnant refused to marry her, so she
Oh.
came to America, and when they asked the last name, she gave the last name Vitanza, which was the name of the man. But she that was kind of her act of spite, and when in a sense was that you may not marry me, but this boy's going to carry your last name.
Good for her. Poor thing.
Yeah, I know, very, very. I know. I was like, well, I guess I come from good stock then. If that was her reaction and the way she processed.
Yeah.
um,
Peasants.
so your question here is what color paints do you find most useful to have in your palette and why? That is a question that really does come up quite a bit and quite often in a day-to-day working environment at the school. And I have to say that it does sometimes change a little bit. So like if I'm working plein air alla prima, I'm working under a different set of conditions than I am if I am working in my studio, where I'm most likely working through I tend to be very layered in my own work ethic. And
Mhm.
when so if I'm plein air painting, which is really the exact opposite of what my normal kind of painting day would be like. So I'm using titanium white there as opposed to lead white, which I prefer in my regular studio practice, because lead white, there is, so I, you know, I, there is that big debate about the whole toxicity element, and it is one to definitely think about for yourself and kind of what is the best choices. I do think that if you take the proper precautions and everything, I do feel like it is, if that set aside, I do feel like it is the superior white of the two options, especially for painting flesh. I think it's friendlier, it's more transparent, it dries quicker. When it dries, it actually dries in a way that bends and is flexible. So as your surface, because oil paint literally breathes to dry. It's all, like it's literally breathing to dry. It takes in oxygen in order to dry, whereas dryers that you add to your pigments, some of them dry by evaporation, which is what helps to expedite the process a bit more. Um, so lead helps to encourage the drying time of oil paint. It actually helps to average the drying time of your pigments. So you can imagine if you're using like let's say ultramarine blue, which tends to be a rather slow drying pigment. If you're using ultramarine, it helps that it helps your lead helps your ultramarine dry at a more even rate with your other pigments to kind of just help that aging process to be as like what's the word, archivally sound is the thing that we usually say when it means like it'll, that's kind of like the healthiest thing you could do for your painting. So I think that so that would be one distinction, but I would say ultimately my ideal palette would, besides the white thing, would be so lead white, which lead white I do prefer. So I really like Old Holland's Kremnitz white, which is a real lead white. That's really beautiful. It's very buttery. I think it covers better than other lead whites. It's actually a bit more opaque. It behaves a little bit more like a titanium sort of because of that fact. Um, it's not the most expensive. It is on, like most Old Holland things, it is on the more expensive end of the spectrum, but it isn't the most you'll buy. Like it isn't the most expensive option out there. But otherwise, so natural pigments Kremnitz is my really, I love that one. Old Holland, I'm sorry, Old Holland Kremnitz and natural pigments. I do like both of their lead whites. They have I know now they have more, but there's lead white #1 and lead white #2. Number one is linseed oil, number two is walnut. They both do different things. I mean, two is a little bit brighter, it's stringier. So like when you dip your brush in it and lift up, it's almost like um, it really does almost look like pasta strands almost coming off. And that's what we call thixotropic in paint language. It describes the kind a quality of a paint that behaves like a liquid when it's in motion and then behaves like a solid when not in motion. And that's what gives partially what gives some painters like Rembrandt the ability to be in two worlds at once. They can be very thick, but yet fluid in their brushwork. And that's partially one of the reasons why that's possible. Otherwise, I love Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre. I think Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre is superior to Yellow Ochre because I just find that Yellow Ochre, and you know, manufacturers are of course different. I find it to be a little on the greener side. So I find that it kind of tends to look almost like an extra virgin olive oil at times. And I feel like when I'm using it for flesh, which is kind of a pretty standard color for flesh, it does kind of, in my opinion, veer it to the greener side of things, which is not necessarily bad, but I do want to be able to control that. So I think Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre is a superior yellow ochre, but that's really just a personal preference. In terms of a higher chroma yellow, that is a really an addendum color for me. So cad yellow and cad orange, for example, sometimes they are just the thing you need to get what you're after, but sometimes they can cloudy the like kind of they can be a little unneeded. And sometimes when we put colors on the palette, there's this kind of psychological thing where we almost feel like obligated to use every pigment that we put out, essentially. The other yellows that I do like that are on the higher chroma would be, of course, just a cad yellow. I don't like cad yellow light. I feel like it's a little too cool for my taste. It kind of cool. It goes to a yellow and cool direction, which I don't like. I can make a yellow go cool. I'd rather it be more inherently warm. That I can't do. I can't make a yellow brighter, but I can make it weaker with white or some of the umbers, or etc. Naples yellow is also, I think, sometimes a color that doesn't get a lot of credit, but it is a really nice color, especially if you're a figure painter or a portrait painter. Bouguereau used Naples yellow a lot, and it's a very nice, understated, quiet, friendly yellow. And it's a cooler yellow, which is nice as well, but it is very natural, and it kind of, it really also is a really nice color to lighten things that's not white. So one of the things that when you're first learning to paint, that is, I think one of them, as usual, the biggest things to learn are, and the hardest things to learn are the most fundamental because they challenge us on a more primal level. So not using white always to lighten, not using black always to darken. Sometimes those simple things are the biggest hurdles, even for experienced painters to not fall back into. So Naples yellow is kind of a really good, if you feel like you're an over white user, Naples yellow can be a really good like trainer wheels to kind of help you not overuse white too much. Reds, I'm a redaholic. It's the color I have the most of in my painting box. Like I have so many different shades of red. The ones that are the most common and frequent on my palette are, I love genuine vermilion. And to be specific, I love genuine Chinese vermilion, which has this pinkish blue hue to it. It's just superior to cadmium, in my opinion, except it's very expensive and because it's toxic to use. So I think it's if I remember correctly, I believe it's like chemical signature is arsenic or something. So like when they actually are checking for vermilion in paintings, they're looking for traces of arsenic and to determine if a painting is legitimate or not, for example. So genuine vermilion is great. Otherwise, I do prefer a cad red medium or a cad red deep personally. I do have cad red light, and I do actually like a Michael Harding's cad red light. I do prefer. Cad red light I find can be very orange, and when I see it on people's palettes, I often misconstrue it for a cad orange or like a dark yellow. And when I get to the red portion of my palette, I'm looking for discernible red options. And so if I feel like I have an option that feels like it's more in the yellow family, I don't consider that technically a red family member. So I think that the cad red medium and the deep represent in my mind what I think of when I think of the word red. It's like a prime red, and that's what I want from that high chroma red option on my palette. So cad red medium or deep. After that, I do think a medium value earth red is to me is essential. The problem is it varies a lot, and that's where, so I'll always have like a Terra Rosa, a Venetian red, an English red. They're all kind of variations on a theme. So I usually will have one of those next to Cad or Vermilion, whichever one I'm using. But that one I do change a bit because that's the one I might change to the needs of my model, because historically speaking, Caucasian skin is orange. If when we think about the hue, Caucasian skin and even skin of darker tones can be termed as orange, meaning that it is comprised of a yellow and a red, basically. And when you do get into your umbers are oranges to an extent. They have reds and they have yellows. Like burnt umber, for example, is thought of as a dark orange, even though it is kind of a red. And historically speaking, painters would use a singular earth tone. I'm generalizing, of course, by saying this, but it would be common for painters to use an earth tone like red umber, burnt umber, things of that sort. And that would be their base, like almost like their starter dough for the flesh tones is just that color plus white. And then they were using the other, so vermilion, yellow ochre, black to then suppress and cool or warm and embolden the color choices. But really, when you're studying traditional representationalism, really the thing that you keep coming up against time and time again is doing a lot with very simple means. So all the palettes tend to be very simple. They're just very sophisticated ratios that they're using or overlapping essentially. So CAD red, like a Terra Rosa or an English red, something along those lines. And then so this is where it's going to sound a little like alliteration. I do like red umber and burnt umber, even though they technically are the same pigment. Red umber is just a little bit more chromatic. It's a little bit lighter than burnt umber. So it's kind of like a little bit of an in-between a burnt umber and like a Terra Rosa, for example. It's kind of somewhere in the middle there. And sometimes sometimes, especially in flesh painting, you want something that's of a darker value, but of a certain personality level when it comes to the chroma. And sometimes that can be really hard to mix. And so having something that's earth, like out of the tube, it has that inherent quality, can just be a huge help. So the other umbers that I'll have is so my palette is kind of a little bit on the umber heavy side. I love green umber. I learned to paint with it, and I just kind of really fell in love with it personally. It's a bit stronger than a traditional raw umber, but that's why I like it. It's because it gives me a bit of a wider range of options. And so this is where, again, it's a little bit of alliteration. I'll have green umber and raw umber, but I tend to use Old Holland's raw umber, which is much more on the warmer yellow side. Raw umber is one of those pigments that changes wildly from manufacturer to manufacturer. So if you have like a Michael Harding raw umber, which I do like too, by the way, and that's actually really similar to what's Sargent's raw umber, as a fun fact. But Old Holland's raw umber is just much more yellow. It's just much warmer. It's just much more, and I'm just drawn to warmer options. I just think they work, that they're just friendlier and all this stuff with other pigments. Then getting into, so the raw umber is on there as well. I do use ultramarine as a blue and as a warm blue. I love cerulean. Cerulean's on my palette, although cerulean's very expensive, so it will be one of those things that I'll try to see how far I can get without cracking it out. And then when I feel like, okay, I do kind of need this, then I will put it out. I was fortunate enough to run into somebody who was generous enough to, as a thank you gift at the end of a workshop, bought me a small tube of Old Holland's cerulean, which is one of their most expensive pigments. But
Wow.
as usual with Old Holland, you get what you pay for. So the pigmentation strength of that is insane. So you really only need like a quarter of a teaspoon on your palette, and that'll probably be more, depending on what you're doing, of course. That'll probably be more than enough. But I love cerulean as a blue. It's a great grayer. It's a as far as the blues are concerned, ultramarine is always thought of as a warm blue. It's called the red blue. Cobalt is kind of more of a middle of the kind of, I guess you could think of it as a prime blue, like when you say the word blue and you look at it on a color wheel, that's more like what cobalt will offer you. It's also a bit more opaque. I do have limited experience with cobalt. It just was not part of my training, and I never really had much of a reason to kind of go into that. Same with Prussian blue. I know of it and I've dabbled, but I haven't really used it heavily in a painting. And cerulean is always thought of as the gray blue, the green blue, or the neutral blue. And if I'm landscape painting, you know, actually, it seems a little strange to have like 3 or 4 or even 5 different blues on your palette, but they do offer you very different things. And when you're out on location and everything is an emergency, that does help. The color that I probably don't have on my palette the most is probably the color that most people don't, which is green. I do have a green umber, like I said, and I do have a raw umber, which sometimes is thought of as a green. But I do have 2 greens in my palette that are kind of like, again, addendum colors. So chromium oxide green is a great green. That's a traditional green. Rubens used it, Van Dyke. Um, it's basically, I think of it like the green equivalent of a cerulean. It's about the same value. It's a green that's on the yellower end, not like Viridian, which is on the bluer end. And it's a great grayer. It's great grayer for flesh. Green is a great thing to have on a palette for flesh. And I know that sounds very strange, but red is red is easily and sophisticatedly controlled with green. So when you do see pinks and reds diminish on skin, rather than reaching for something like burnt umber or gray, which may rob it or make it look too monochrome of its chroma, the complement always gives you a slightly more sophisticated drop off in saturation. And so greens are great for flesh, which is why in the school's palette, green umber is on there because it really does. And when students do the warm cool assignment, when they're painting the figure using a warm red umber, a cool green umber, well, a green umber and ivory black and white. So you're going from warm, which is the red, into using the green to neutralize red. So you go from warm to neutral, and then from neutral to blue, or the black in this case. And it's a really great exercise that actually Harold Speed talks about doing in his book on painting, where he says that a great exercise to do to study temperatures is to do a black and a warm cool using Venetian red as your warm, and I want an ivory black as your cool, and doing a painting of Velasquez's, I believe it's Aesop. Excuse me, it's a full figure portrait, but he was just saying just to do the head study, and it's surprising how it almost looks like the painting only using those 2 colors. But anyway, so green is probably so Viridian I do sometimes use, and chrome oxide green I do sometimes use, but they're the rarest ones that, like, they're there and I do like them, but they're really kind of a very specialty case. And then of course I do have like sap green and stuff like that, but sometimes I think it's just because someone told me that those were useful and I tried it and I'm like, oh, interesting. But they're very, like, sometimes you use them for like a very, like, one time, like they're very kind of like, it's almost like having kitchen gadgets that have one purpose. So when that one purpose comes along, you have the perfect tool for it, but otherwise it's just sitting there. So sometimes that's kind of like that. But yeah, and not to give a long answer to that question, but anyway, those are kind of my basic kind of favorites. But sometimes it does shift. Like I'll go through like phases where it's like, oh, I really just like discovered this color and I love it, and I'm using it where I don't need it, kind of a thing. But did that answer your question? Any
Oh, yeah.
follow or any other?
Yeah, I apologize. I was looking down because I was taking notes,
Oh yeah, no, no
virtually.
problem. Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
no problem. Yeah, oh, my pleasure. You're welcome. You're welcome. So I know that there's a couple other questions here. So I know that oh, Carmela, how are you? Let's see. Oh, so sorry. So right before you, Carmela, there's Myra. And Myra, your question is, how do you deal with the problem of dividing the information into layers and the amount of information you put into each layers? Do you always have in mind how the layers affect each other? So that's a really important question. It's a very big question, Maya. um, so this is actually something that a lot of our a lot of our process, like a lot of the process in the school actually does address this, because this is what being an indirect painter is largely about. So with the term indirect versus direct, when you're indirect, it means that you are working towards your solutions. So it's like a goal that you're working towards. And the way you're working towards them is by doing layers. And with each layer, you're limiting yourself to a specific set of focuses and concerns and issues so that you're not overwhelmed at any one time. And by the time all the layers are compiled together, you've thought of each element carefully, but never at once. So it's a much more manageable way. Direct painting is where you're doing the opposite. You're immediately coming to conclusions and trying to resolve problems on site as quickly as you can. And so when you're working indirect, the couple of things you want to be thinking about how to construct layers is you want to start out thin to thick. That is one golden rule that I think, regardless of what philosophy of painting or what school of that you've studied under, that is kind of really more of a just kind of like almost like the anatomy of a well-constructed painting is that of quicker drying and thinner layers to start. And if you are looking to use more full-bodied and thicker layers, those will come in gradually at the end. And those layers should also be slower drying as well, to ensure that you don't have quicker drying layers up top and then slower drying layers underneath, which will then promote cracking and start to create other issues down the line. So that would be one thing. But I think the other element about working in layers that's really crucial, and this is something that even experienced painters have to be, it's like you can't really escape the basics. Like pianists can't escape the scales. It's like if you can't do the scales, you can't play, Rachmaninoff's third. It's just that kind of a simple equation. When it comes to the layering process, it is always the golden rule is big to small, simple to complex. And if you follow that basic formula, that will usually kind of throw you into the right in the right direction, or into the results that you're looking to have. Now that is a language all in its own. How to look at something and to break it down into its most basic essentials does take practice, and it does take a persistent practice to cultivate that. And that's where the training of going to an academy really that's really what it's there for. Yes, you do learn the basics on how to draw, quote properly and paint properly, if you want to call it that. But more importantly, you're learning how to see things properly, and you're learning how to see things in a proper sequencing, because that's what the average person doesn't do. And you have to remember that as a representational painter, you're in the business of you're basically an illusionist. You're trying to make somebody believe that this two-dimensional surface has a vanishing point, there's an atmosphere, a light effect. And to do that, kind of like a magician, you need to know the sleight of hand. How do I trick them? How do I get them to look here while I sneak the rabbit through the hat in this hand? And so one of the things that you want to be doing is general to specific. So like if you were to paint, well, I know like right now I don't really have like a huge light and shadow pattern, but if you were to kind of like the first layer for my block in on my face right now is that I have, if I squint down, I can see that I have a shadow pattern that goes down my face. And I would really be starting off this painting with two values, a shadow and a light. And, I can see all of this complexity, but if I just reduce my responsibilities to just making sure the light and shadow shapes are fine, then that I can do. But if I'm looking at reality and I'm seeing an infinite, nature is infinite. So I have to provide a grammar to it and say, okay, well, I'm going to start off with just the shadows and the lights. And once I feel relatively confident in that, I'll get a little bit thicker. And that will allow me to, discuss the big local color of things. So to give you a little bit of a formula that you can apply to yourself and help to kind of help to define your own work ethic of working from simple to complex. Our general kind of painting process starts with what we call either a cartoon or a dry brush. Both of those things do effectively the same thing, which is to work out the drawing beforehand. So in a cartoon, you're drawing your model in pencil and then transferring that drawing to the painting surface. So the drawing pre-exists the modeling and the painting part of the painting itself. The dry brush is when you skip the drawing element and you just go directly to canvas. So you're doing on the cartoon what you're doing like on the canvas instead. So you're using typically a singular color, an earth tone, typically raw umber or burnt umber, and your two main concerns are proportion and light and shadow. Once that's been established, the next stage is kind of that local color lay-in, where you're just really putting in what looks like large flat continents of different colors. And what you're doing is, think of it like you're putting down flat primers or flat imprimaturas, what we call the tone of a canvas, for each section. So like, again, you would say the background is generally this color. You're not talking about how it goes from light to dark. That's for the next layer. You're just saying it's beige or it's blue and it's about this value. The shirt is about this color. And you're really giving yourself 1 to 2 colors and values per element. Very simple. Once you have the local color kind of mapping in, then your responsibility is to go to each local color and apply a general sense of mass. So to take it from a dark shirt to a mass of a body, not necessarily fabric yet, but you're taking it from a flat color to a volumed color. Once you have a basic volume, then you're breaking things down subsequently, almost like those Russian wooden dolls, where it's the same image, just smaller, smaller, smaller. So you're always thinking big. And how do I simplify that? How do I say that with the fewest amount of words? It's just that your size shrinks. That's the only difference, and that's really the trick. When you're working detail, if you start thinking small and superficial, the detail will not work. But if you're working small and you're thinking, well, this smallness still has a logic to it, there's a structure. What's the structure of the detail? Like Jur said, that even with highlights on eyes, you should be thinking about how the white of the highlight goes on the ball of the eye. There should be a thought process behind it, not just a white pinprick and that's it, because that doesn't really do the same thing. And then at the end of this, so this kind of this interim stage of going from simple volumes to specific volumes, that's where you're working pretty much at the full opacity of your oil paint. And that's where you could almost say it's kind of like an alla prima, where you're taking it from that general volume and you're basically now making, as my teacher would say, make that look like that. It's kind of that stage. It's not anticipatory. You're not looking to swing back. You're saying, okay, if I don't come back to this represents the best I can do. And then of course, finishing with glazing and retouching, because even though we work at the top of our abilities the whole way through, and especially at the last, in the last throws of the painting, it's still, we don't get everything, we're human. So we do have to swing back around and kind of finesse things with glazing and scumbling. Historically, this was called the revision pass. And what's nice about that is they can sometimes see where a painter has come back and has said, oops, I didn't get this right, and touches it up. And so they can literally see, like there's a Rembrandt painting where early one, where you can almost see him finishing it, stepping back and saying, oh, damn, I didn't get this right. And when archivists see that, they actually call those autograph retouching, because it's a retouch, but it's like their signature. You can really see almost the handwriting of the process. So just in general, I know that's kind of trying to summarize a very complicated process very simply. That's generally what our process consists of, with a lot more nuance, but that kind of gives you just a very broad outline. And I think that if you were to approach working in layers those two ways, from simple to complex and from thin to thicker, if you follow those two general guidelines, you'll have much more success in painting in an indirect way. And it's one of the most effective and most early forms of oil painting is actually to do monochrome underpaintings and then put transparent color on top of it. That goes back to egg tempera, which is the predecessor or the ancestor of oil painting. So even if that has some attraction to you, that is also a very valid and frankly, a very good way of, I think, learning the properties of painting, because it allows you to deal with drawing and value work in one pass, and then the color is its own separate thing. And I think, again, when you're starting, and frankly, even when you know what you're doing, um, sometimes, you breaking it down really is a big help. And it's sometimes the thing that, once you have a few paintings under your belt, sometimes you feel like you can take on more, and sometimes you can, but it's still very hard. So anyway, I hope that helped to answer your question, Myra, in terms of layering.
It did. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. So Carmela, so your question is, I always have problems with creating smooth backgrounds. Would a mop brush help? Okay, so this is interesting question there. So mop brushes, for those of you who don't know, it basically are somewhat kind of what it sounds like. They look very similar to makeup brushes, except the hairs are a little longer, and they're very soft. So, okay, this is where personal preference does kind of take effect. So I don't like the mop brushes as much as others do. So I know that Julie, for example, you can use them, and she can manage to use them very well. This is where it's like that different strokes for different folks things. When it comes to like charcoal, for example, I usually can't get stomps to work very well for me, especially with vine charcoal. But I know that other people get beautiful results with those. I don't like flats. Other people can use flats brilliantly. Odd Nerdrum uses flats, to marvelous effects. I just can't. It's just not for me. Mop brushes are kind of the same. Honestly, what I find does a better job when it comes to backgrounds they are tough. Actually, Rubens actually said backgrounds are the hardest thing to do, which is kind of funny. When you think of Rubens, there's like this string of like naked figures that are almost like wrestling through the painting, and he's like, oh yeah, that no big deal, but the color of the background, oh yeah, it's
I always have a problem with the background. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Look at my paintings and I'm thinking, how
yeah,
come I make that background like that?
well, it is something that, so in the last lecture I did on composition for art history, we looked at Alma Tadema, and Alma Tadema, in his painting, I'm an Alma Tadema nut. I think I like him better than Bouguereau. I know that's blasphemy in academia, but he's just like his paintings read like movies to me. He was so ahead of his time. Anyway, but he has this beautiful painting of Antony meeting Cleopatra, and the background he went through so many different versions of. And there's even records of people visiting his studio and explaining like what the background looked like at different intervals. It ends up just being a sea with warships, which I think is really fitting. He's casting Antony Cleopatra against this kind of almost a chess of war in the background, which is kind of, illustrating the ill fate of their relationship. But so with backgrounds, so Harold Speed, I always this feels like this is I feel like I'm at church right now and I'm spreading the gospel of Harold Speed. I'm mentioning him so much. But Harold Speed does talk about backgrounds where he says something that's so simple, but it really did help me think better about backgrounds. Where he says, a background's main purpose is to be supportive. It is to support the main subject, not to detract. And if it does, then it has overstepped its boundary in a sense.
So that's why you want it smooth, so it doesn't come forward.
Right. So getting back to the technical things. So there's a couple things about backgrounds that can help assist you in maintaining those things. So there's this very well-known and well-established rule amongst representational and traditional painters. Your lights should be thick, your shadows should be thin. And that's generally true. the added thing to that is that your background should be thinner and your foreground should be thicker. The idea being that if your paint is thicker, it literally creates a relief, a sculptural sense, and so that you would reserve that for the objects in the foreground to give it that effect. So it's not that your background should be like dry brushy, it's just that comparatively, again, the value of looking at things through relationships, your background should ideally have less paint than the objects in the foreground. They should have the most paint. So that's one thing. But in terms of blender brushes, I have to say that I still prefer big fan brushes. I think large fan brushes are the superior blenders for backgrounds. I also think that when it comes to backgrounds and gradients.
Right, that's what I mean, the gradient, yeah.
So the other thing about that is you have to mix more of the transitions than you think. When it comes to transitions, I think, or gradients rather, a lot of people kind of basically kind of stack maybe a dark, a mid, a light, and then they kind of just blend in between. There's too much happenstance blending. Happenstance blending is very valuable to a painter, but if you're just kind of if you're just relying on that to do all the work, it's not going to be calibrated enough to be convincing. So I would say that like I mean, every situation is different, but I would say that like for a gradient, I don't know even what to call an average gradient of a background. But if you have a perceptible, I would say at least 5 values, at least 5,
Okay.
maybe
Yeah.
6. And that's where, you know, again, you're in a background, mix twice the amount that you think you'll need. It's better to throw out a little bit of extra paint at the end of the day than to halfway through your background and realize you ran out and then have to remix it. And then you feel like it's not quite the same.
Yeah.
You know, and then you start thinking, what am I doing with my life? And you spiral, you know. But I think that in terms of like the mop brushes, I do think that I think that that large fan brushes are superior. And I'll tell you why. I think it's because the brush profile, and I think that's the big difference. Mop brushes are a big wad of hairs. And so if used improperly, keyword, you can actually almost like a broom push off or push around paint. When you're blending, you want to integrate. You are looking to let the pigment particles intermit, mingle. And I think a fan brush being a single row of hairs, it's a much more gentle touch. So it's much more likely to, encourage that as opposed to a large, wider like collection of hairs, which might be more aggressive. However, I will say that I do use a mop brush sometimes because sometimes blending is not so much of a stroke technique of X's like this. It's more of a blot, 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 almost like you're blending, literally like if you were blending makeup.
Right.
Sometimes you actually do blend paint that way. And in those instances, a mop brush or a soft round brush would actually be ideal for those instances. So I think that for getting gradients and backgrounds, I would say mix more values than you think. That's really a huge part of it. I recommend fan brushes, but again, mop brushes do beautiful work. It just like, this is where I would say experiment and see where it works for you.
Right.
And then I guess the third thing, give it time. Like you do have to work the gradient a bit. I remember millions of years ago when Julie was doing her first cast painting, and it had a noticeable, a big gradient from dark to light in the background. And I remember she calls this as having her first, she recollects this as her first meltdown, in the process. And one of the things was that she just like, you just have to give it time. Like you really have to spend the time carefully nudging back and forth. And it does, it's not really technically that demanding. It just demands the time investment from you. And sometimes that alone can feel like this isn't coming together. This isn't coming together. I'm not doing something right. And it's like, no, it's just a long car trip. Just, just keep going.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
And
I'll practice that with the painting I'm working at the school.
And just two last things about backgrounds. I would, if you're all those things and you're still struggling to have your background feel recessed, I would say lower your chroma. That's another thing. Gray your backgrounds. Even if in reality it's like a bright sky, gray your backgrounds, defocus attention. My eye is less interested in grayer things, and lessen your contrast. That's another thing I see in a lot of people's like multi-figurative works or landscape works, is that it's a little paradoxical, because in studio painting, when you have controlled light, dark and higher contrast things get darker as they go back. But in nature, things get lighter and they get
Right.
they get more compressed and disappear more. So I would say the other two visual elements would be to compress your values and lower your chroma in your background, and that'll also be huge helps.
Okay. All right.
And
Thank
soften
you.
edges. And soften edges.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stop there. But those are some things that I know do help.
Right.
Uh,
Thank you.
okay, you're welcome. Okay, so let's see here. So Darcy Adams here is asking, what is the origin of the origin and history of doing the color study before the painting? I have a general idea of why, but would like to hear your expertise. So thank you, Darcy. So color studies do have color studies are, for those of you who don't know what a color study is, think of it of like the dress rehearsal before the performance. So this is when a painter is doing what it really sounds like, a color study. They're doing a much smaller version of the painting that is in their head. And this is when historically, you'll see painters like Bouguereau, Alma-Tadema, using sketches from models, miniquettes, like Nikolai Poussin built little miniatures, wax figures with like drapery, and would paint that with in full color, so that they could get a sense of, and it would illuminate to them technical difficulties they would encounter, help them to understand if the composition was going to do everything they had hoped. It almost serves as a guinea pig to make adjustments on to get everything right before then even investing a single brushwork in the actual piece. It also just, and for us in the academy, it really gives students a time to just really devote themselves solely to the searching of color, because in the rest of the painting process, you're thinking of color and shape, or color and transition. So there's always color and plus one. So the color study allows you to kind of just focus on that. And color studies can be as abstract. So one of my teachers for a portrait would literally do an egg on a cylinder on a rectangle for a body. That's it. And that way, when he was in front of somebody, he wasn't seduced to make it look like them and make a small painting. It reminded him of the purpose of what he was doing. So so it removed that temptation from him a little bit. And there are other people who do smaller paintings. Like right now, myself, I have a study that is basically almost like a small painting. But the only reason why I did that is because I was trying and experimenting different ways of actually painting things. So I had to bring things to a high finish in order to see if it would actually get me to the destination I wanted to. So some people that I think are really great to look at for how valuable studies can be, and you can really see like the study and then how it translates into their work. Frederick Leighton, he's almost annoying, because you see his studies and it's almost, he nails it, and then it's just an exact copy in the painting. And that happens a number of times. So with his, I think it's Perseus, and I'm forgetting the woman that gets chained up and is sacrificed to the monster. But in that painting, the study that survives, it's literally the painting. It's like he found it and then translated it. The other painting he did of the famous one of the round painting of the woman in orange, kind of crouched with the sea behind her. You can see the study of that, again, almost a mirror image of what that looks like. So Leighton is a great person to see like how, oh, he nailed it there. And like, you can see like the study sheet, and then like the rough draft, and then the final script. Alma-Tadema is great, and John William Waterhouse are also great because you see them change their minds. So I like them because you see them go down a path confidently saying this is the choice. And then at some point, and that's, you don't know why, because they're not alive to ask, they just say, no, that's not it. And that happens with, in Waterhouse, that happens with I think it's called The Favorites of Emperor Honorus, another Italian name. There you go. I think it's Honorus, I believe. But he's called the worst emperor of Rome because when Rome was being sacked, one of his advisors come in and say Rome is in danger, and his favorite chicken was named Rome, so he was afraid for his chicken instead of the city. So Waterhouse depicts him actually sitting there pathetically feeding pigeons and chickens while his advisors are kind of waiting on bated breath to know what he wants to do. But in his original composition, he doesn't look as pathetic. It's a very developed painting. It's like halfway done, but he looks more kingly. Like he's sitting more upright and he's got a crown on straight and he just looks more stately. And I think that that's why Waterhouse, like, he looks too dignified. I want to make him look very pathetic and almost teetering on like a beggar, so to speak. So those are great people to look at. And of course, Bouguereau's great because he's Bouguereau. He's a technical genius, never does a wrong brushstroke, well, sorry, you know what I mean. But he's another great person that has numerous studies where you can see that those things. But I think that what we call studies by like color studies that invest oil paint and all that stuff, that's a more 19th. Well, all right, I would say that that's a more modern phenomenon. I would say that in the past, like if you're thinking of like Baroque or pre-Baroque, Renaissance, or even further back, usually they would only go as far as like sketches, and then from like that would really be the furthest they would go, just because color was not as what's the word? It was much more expensive, harder to come by. It would be much more. I mean, but then again, you have Dürer doing these gouache paintings that are the first alla prima landscape paintings in art history as he makes his travels. So it's kind of a half truth. But I do think that like studies are immensely valuable because they give you a chance to it really is like a director, like, let's rehearse the scene. Actors, take your places, let's do this line. And it's like, okay, Meryl, you're coming on too strong. I need you to that's really what it's like. But I think if you look at those three painters, Alma Tadema, Frederick Leighton, and John William Waterhouse, you'll see all of them and really how they keep the sketch and they nail it, and then how they change their mind. It's like, and sometimes you can see why too. And again, unfortunately, it's a wild guess because we can't ask them. But in terms of those are the main reasons why we do studies. So I hope that does help to answer your question.
Thank you very much. That was
yeah, my pleasure. Oh, and Lori, thank you. So that painting of the woman in orange by Leighton is I believe and oh no, the woman that Perseus is rescuing, I think, is called Andromeda. I believe that's the right name. I'm missing my my mythology. It's terrible. Okay, so let's see. So, Mr. Weatherford, it's good to hear from you. So, when are you creating a still life or a figure setup? What should one look for in a solid composition? Oh my God. Well,
you did not just call me that.
What, Mr. Weather? Well,
I'm not old.
Yeah, I know this is where you would say, you're the elder here, sir.
My kids, I am.
Oh, right, that's right. I forget you probably hear. Yeah, that's probably sending twitches to like, oh, I'm not at work. So this is really, I once many years ago, I had a student once come up to me and saying, I don't know how you teach composition because it seems like it's something inherent. You either understand it or you don't, and I don't know if that's teachable. And I was like, oh, I'm like, well, I do, I think of composition as kind of like the plot of a story. It's kind of like it's the thing that holds everything together. And I think depending on what it is what kind of story you're telling, your plot needs to kind of accommodate that. And so I think that for I wish I had an image of it to show everybody here, but John, our one of our figure and anatomy instructors, when he did his red, white, and green still life, it was a lot about which had to do with and I hope he doesn't mind me kind of talking about this with but his painting had to do a lot with kind of like the manipulation of religion and how easily that can be to kind of, to use that over people. And one of his compositional elements is that the drapery in the background, if you really look at it, the drapery is shaped in the form of a scorpion to kind of give you this idea of how a scorpion kind of, that venom that it stings you with. When you look at the painting, you don't notice it at all. But then once you kind of are aware of it, you do kind of see that. And that's kind of what Cindy calls viewer rewards, like things that you don't notice at first, but after spending time with it, you go, oh, wow, look at that. So in that instance, that's perfect for it. It's subtle, subliminal, almost like what he's commenting on itself. And it works great in that. And then on the other side of it, I have another student who's working, her background is in botany, I think, and I might have the wrong science discipline. And she's doing a painting based on that's all about the climate. And so it's all boxes that are teetering, and it's in a square format. So she's giving you a stable square and then giving you instability within that. So it's I don't know. It's a really tough thing to have a singular answer to. Like, I think what makes a good composition is the consideration about the message that you're saying and the form that it's taking. I think that's the key to it. I think and that's what makes masterpieces. Like, that's what Simon Schama says. That's what makes Turner's The Slave Ship perfect, is a perfect marriage between message and form. He paints that painting when England's kind of congratulating itself about abolishing slavery, and he paints this horrific, like, thorn in the side of English history episode of men and women being thrown overboard to be claimed as losses at sea for insurance. But he paints it in a savage way, and it's this savage painting of this savage event, and it's a perfect marriage. And the composition, like, there's a split down the canvas. It's almost biblical, end of the world kind of thing. If you look at Turner's, is that Turner that I'm thinking of? Yes. Oh, okay. I almost said Constable. Very different. Of Hannibal crossing the Alps, another perfect composition because it's a perfect marriage of message and form. In this instance, this is a very contemporary painting because Hannibal really represents Napoleon, who is going across the Alps at this time. But you see that huge black squall, like a bird's beak, and then the sun is kind of like the bird's eye of prey, and it's kind of pecking almost at Hannibal's forces and all this stuff. So again, a perfect marriage of this kind of large, grand, almost cinematic painting. So I think that you have to be thinking of I would say that the key to success in one of the keys of success to composition is to really be thinking about the relationship, and to also think about the relationship between the message and form, and how think of composition as an author thinks about plot. They're one and the same. They are both the thing that is the hand against your back to lead you through the story, or in our case, the picture plane. This is also immensely on taste level too. Like, so this is also where you can express your sense of, of taste, where artists like to play with certain compositional things, like purposefully leading you off the canvas, and things like that. And some people don't like to do that because they think it's leading you out of the thing they want to keep you in, essentially. So I know that's kind of a real general answer to your question, but I don't know if there's like something more pointed that that you would like me to say on it, but that's like the closest answer I can come to right now for that.
No, that's good, Garrett. I appreciate it.
Okay, good. Well, good to hear from you. I'm glad that babbling made some sense. So, Jean Keller here is asking to backtracking to background blending. Do you have a favorite fan brush, hard, soft, size, brand? I have way too many brushes in my collection, no such thing, but can always justify one or two more. Absolutely, you can always justify one or two more or five more. This is where I get the whole like women and having that cliche, like can't have another, like there's no such thing as enough shoes. I totally subscribe to the whole, there's no such thing as too many brushes. Okay, when it comes to, I can answer that to a certain extent. So like, I prefer soft. So soft for, if we're to go back to answering the question, to blend the background more effectively, definitely soft hair brushes. Some people do have a more of a preference between synthetic soft and natural soft. Synthetic has made such large strides that you almost can't tell the difference. When I'm blending kind of like my other non-fan brushes that are blender brushes, they are red sable brushes, which I know are harder to get now, but they do a beautiful job. I do have synthetic soft brushes because the natural soft brushes for the sizes that I'm using, they're just way too they're just out of my budget. Now I think one of them, brand-wise, trying to remember off the top of my head what I have. One of them I know is a gold Taklon from the Trekell series, which is a synthetic version. So I am also a sucker for like a cheap package of brushes. Sometimes I've had some of my favorite brushes are bargain bin brushes that somehow have made it through the years, even though they were very cheap. So one of my fan brushes are one of these brushes. I think the brand is Royal and Langnickel, which is really not an expensive brush, but again, it's a synthetic soft. And I like that one because it has a thinner row of hairs than other fan brushes. So it's even softer in its application. So that's something to think about too when purchasing fan brushes. Like look at the, like if this is the, oh, I can't make a fan. Like looking at the fan, like look at it from the aerial view, like down, and look at the thickness of the hair row. The thinner the row of hairs, the more of a gentle touch and the more gentle blending it'll do. The thicker, the more, I'll use the word aggressive, but like the more oomph it'll have in its blendability. And I do think I have a Winsor Newton. Oh, I can't believe I'm forgetting this. My teacher uses these all the time. Not a Skoda.
Monarch.
Monarch, thank you, Dale. I knew, yeah, because Monarch, I do have one small Monarch fan brush, and that's also really good. So those are the ones that off the top of my head that I can that I would recommend for those purposes. Like bristle fan brushes are good for like creating wood grain because you can kind of like create long striations and thick paint, but they're not great for blending. So like those are good for other things though. So I hope that helps to clarify some of those, like some of those options for you. Let's see. So Terry, you have a question here. Terry, you're asking, from the perspective of a bird natural history artist whose training is rooted in two traditions, classical atelier training and botanical art training. I love like Dürer's botanical drawings. Oh my God, so beautiful. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why watercolor and gouache don't often appear in atelier training. Okay, yeah, I'll definitely, where the usual trajectory of medium is graphite, charcoal, yep, and then culminating in oil. Historically, lots of artists, you've mentioned Dürer, use watercolor and gouache. This is something I've been pondering and give you some. Okay, thank you for that question. That is actually very good. So I love gouache. I love watercolor. And I love drawing for drawing's sake. Like I really love drawing as its own discipline. Drawing is always thought of as, I think, what you do to get to painting. in a sense. It's always seen as kind of the, you know, the inferior to oil paint. It's something you do to get to it. And so I don't subscribe to that. I think drawing in and of itself can be a beautiful medium, but I think that for so long in art history, drawing was the cartooning process. You drew in order to get to the ultimate task, which was to paint. And in fact, in art history, if you were like a printmaker, so actually going back to Dürer, he was known for his engraving skills because he trained as a goldsmith under his father to begin with. And when he went to Venice, the Venetians really said, you only work in black and white. So, you know, so like you're not really an artist. You only work in black and white. And that's when he did his Madonna of the Rosary, and all the Venetians saw him like, yeah, okay, I guess you can paint. But and Dürer, I think also, you know, as I mentioned, his gouaches of landscapes are, I just am mesmerized because this is an individual traveling, you know, in late 1400s, and is painting what he's seeing, mostly what he's seeing. Sometimes it's fictionalized, but it's really kind of the earliest, almost like documentary, alla prima, what's in front of you paintings that we have, and they're just really, really miraculous, I think, really. And I think his watercolor of the hair, his botanical paintings are just like, they're really quite, you almost can't believe a human made them. The reason why I think that is not so promoted in ateliers across the board, I know that some schools probably some do, some don't. And I really can only speak from the perspective of our atelier, because that's really the only thing I can speak from totally, is that all the drawing that we do, so it's ultimately a oil painting school, and the drawing that you do is really thought of as kind of the preparation and the boot camp that gets you to painting. One of the biggest problems in painting, in visual language, if you're a representational painter, is value. The lightness and darkness of things. That is always when people get to paint, they think color's the hard part. It's not. It's more, I'm still talking to people about value. And that's why we keep people in drawing in black and white only for so long. It's because you really need to limit yourself for that long to really understand what value does. Then you can bring color in and then understand this immensely complex relationship with tonalism and chroma and like all and that very complicated duet that happens between them. But then, but you see obviously like Sargent also like using watercolors and doing, amazing things with watercolors that actually surpass a lot of oil paintings, as in my opinion. Winslow Homer, same thing. So I think that, in terms of, academic painters, when I think of academic painters, I think I don't like, so, and I'm like, so like Bouguereau, for example, Meissonier, I don't I don't really, and this is where I could just not be remembering certain facts about them, but I don't think of that being a regular part of their work process where they would use colors from other, and I think that was part of it, is that if you're doing a color study in oil paint and you're an oil painter, you're trying to do the study to also anticipate problems you'll have with oil paint itself. So to use another medium such as gouache or watercolor, it can be informative and helpful, but it won't give you the exact same experience as if you're using oil paint. So in that respect, it might not be the most informative medium to choose if that's what you're doing. But I think it can be immensely helpful in the searching process, like when you're just figuring out sketches. And there you actually do see David use that. So in his tennis court oath that's unfinished, he's using ink and he's using gouache and watercolor to block out light and shadows, because he's searching and he's figuring things out. But once he's figured it out, he's like, right, on to painting. What do I need there? So I think it's used really as a step up, but in the past it was seen as, and it's gone through, varying levels, again, like even Matisse was doing, when Fauvism was kind of given birth to, he was doing mainly watercolors when at the time, sort of. So it's So I think that that's really kind of the main reason. I think that especially for someone who's really into botanical work and who's into landscape painting, like Sargent was, landscape painting was Sargent's first love. It's superior because it's easier to transport, it's quicker drying, it's less toxic. It checks a lot of boxes if you're in either of those fields, I think. But I do think it's unfairly not treated as respectfully as it should be, which is one of the reasons why I love Antonio Lopez Garcia's works, because he treats drawing in pencil as seriously as oil paintings do. And when you see his drawings in person, they omit that authority that like oil paintings do. They have that body, that presence. But I wish it was something that I would myself love to. I'm scared of those mediums partially because I know that it's like controlling water, and like to me that seems so much harder. I myself would love to be more educated in those mediums, because I love, the paint, like what I see. It's just, especially like Andrew Wyeth. Are you kidding me? Or is it Andrew? Yeah, Andrew. Like, oh my God, those dry brush watercolors are just, I mean, you would swear they're oil, or tempera. They're just incredible. It's one of those things that I would like to see more of, but I think because it's always been seen either as like it's like the bridesmaid, never the bride kind of situation almost, but I do think it's unfairly so. So I hope that helped in some way to answer your question on that.
No, that was enormously helpful. Thanks. As soon as you said it's associated sometimes more with the drawing medium, the penny really dropped, because when I think of the master bird artists and natural history painting, like that's done like at that time for like scientific documentation, like pre-cameras, and they're all in watercolors. And so like that's where their heads were mostly out, was documenting for scientific accuracy. I mean, they're still stunningly composed and rendered, but it's like that historical reality informs it too. So thank you. That was a really helpful answer. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. No, my pleasure. No, I'm glad. Let me see here. I know there was another question that I saw. Oops, what did I hit something? Oops, nope. What did I do? Oh boy. So one place where I am really a caveman is really still anything that has to do with tech. Hold on one sec. I enter full screen. That's what I did. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, let me go back to the chat here. Okay. So this is let me see here. This is Myra again. So what do you think about learning to paint by copying or watching the works of minor or lesser known artists? I have heard that because of the temporal proximity, some followers of the great masters might know their techniques. Okay, but have a less polished execution that can shed light. Okay, so that's actually a good point. So certain painters, let's, just because these are two and fresh in my head, Rembrandt, Caravaggio, those are two people whose methods people are always searching to figure out how they did what they did. And I think both of them had a lot of, well, they're a little different. Caravaggio didn't have any formal students, but influenced many, and even people who hated him imitated him. Rembrandt had a huge workshop and did have students, and there's even drawings of him teaching. So you can actually dissect Rembrandt's process through his artistic children. You can actually find his followers. And if you look at, and to your point, because they aren't Rembrandt, like it's his method of painting. So, they're not the inventor of it. They don't do it as well. So you can kind of see, oh, okay, so if he's doing this, he must have learned that. So sometimes that is actually a very good resource, is to look at their students or their teachers. So Pieter Lastman, who's Rembrandt's teacher, you can see some things there where one of his works is actually at the MFA, and you can kind of like, it is like looking at someone's father and saying, oh, there is a likeness there. The handwriting, there's something similar in the paint handwriting. So that is actually a very valid Now, of course, with Caravaggio, that's a problem because his teachers didn't paint like him, and some of his teachers, we don't really know how much, he learned from, because we know that for, I'm going to forget their names now. I know that one was Pietro Terzano, I believe was his name was, and I believe that for him, he painted fruits and flowers for one master, and then he painted portraits for another. And apparently he could do 3 heads in a day, which was, I mean, that's very quick. But so with some painters, that strategy you might hit a dead end with, but it is a very good like resource to use for that. So thank you for bringing that up. That's actually a really great question for that.
Front desk.
God, what?
Oh, sorry. Let's see. So Terry, I know that your hand has been up, but I can't remember. I think I might have answered a question. I don't know if you still have a question or not.
No, sorry, my bad. I forgot to lower it.
Okay, yep. I as I saw your name, I'm like, oh, I think I answered your question, but I just want to make sure.
Can I ask a really super quick one? Is that lecture on composition that you recently gave going to be made available online at any point?
Yes. So we filmed that not last week, it was the week before, so that should be coming, that should be on our YouTube channel I would assume maybe this week. Chris, our video guy, he's pretty good at a quick turnaround, so that should be coming.
I hope that didn't come across as a when's it happening. I just wanted to know if it was going to be made. No. I'm so excited that that's going to be posted. Thank you.
No, not at all. So that should be up, pretty soon. So that'll definitely be coming out. And I do talk about the two Alma Tadimas, but the meeting of Antony and Cleopatra, that I do go into that one there. So that'll be there. But yes, so that'll be coming out soon. So Alberta, I do see your hand up. Can I answer a question for you?
Yes, please. You did mention that you have a teacher, and I'm curious about who that would be. Thank you.
Of course. So I know everybody's biased when they have their, my dad can beat up your dad kind of a thing, but I did benefit from having, who I think, is probably, one of the greatest, if not the greatest teacher of representational painting, which is Fernando Freitas, who is the head instructor, the senior instructor at the Academy of Realist Art in Toronto. And Fernando is probably the best draftsman I've seen. He's one of 3 of the best draftsmen that I've ever, or draftspeople that I've ever seen in my life. But Fernando just has a wealth of, he still looks the same too, which is really infuriating because he looks like he's been in a time capsule, and I look like I've aged 20 years since I met him. It's his European genes. But he has an enthusiasm for paint. He can make you believe that you can do it, and he would instill that confidence and give you sound knowledge where before talking to him you would feel lost and discouraged, and after you would feel emboldened and enlightened. And he also just was very selfless and kind of would, even when I was an early student, would kind of tell me way advanced things that I would have no way of kind of understanding at the time, but as were very valuable. And certain things. So if you do end up watching the composition lecture, there's one compositional element that I talk about called animation, and there's a painting by a German painter with a very hard, long name that I'm not even going to dare to pronounce, who I remember seeing this painting with Fernando in person, and him pointing this out and saying, this is what animation is, and this is how you can use this in a composition. And so that's from him. And I can say that I hope I kind of returned a little bit of this, he's, done so much for me educationally that I also had a great artistic education from my other instructors too, like Ryan Govan, who's one of the other instructors there. He educated me not only in how to really push myself and not settle, but he also taught me how to have a refined taste artistically. So he introduced me to modern art and classical music and modern classical music. And so I really benefited from people who were incredibly talented in what they did, but who were also incredibly talented teachers. And so I really do credit both of, you know, all of them and their teachers too, because it is kind of a lineage that kind of gets passed down that I've been fortunate enough to kind of, luckily enough to have fallen into. But my teacher, yeah, Fernando Freitas, and yeah, probably the best teacher there is. So I was very, very fortunate. He was my main teacher, like I said, and also, you know, I had friends that I learned from as well. So, but he's definitely my you know, he's the Carlos Duran to my Sargent, I guess. I'm not saying that I'm anything like Sargent. It's just like the painter master duo I could think of first, or, you know, he's the Emperor Palpatine to my Darth Vader. But yeah, and if you ever have the chance to study with him or anything, I really, really highly recommend studying with him. He's a wonderful teacher and a great person.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And then Susan Wilcox here is asking, is there a connection between painting alla prima and achieving realism versus more impressionistic loose brushstrokes versus indirect painting? Can you achieve realism painting alla prima? Yes, you can achieve a tight realist finish doing alla prima painting. And in fact, a lot of academic painters of the past, like Ang, for example, I'm going to say that in some of his paintings, he was direct, and it's actually like, so he would say to his students in his atelier, he'd walk around saying the word demi-tone, halftone, over and over, halftone, halftone, halftone. The key to form is halftones. And so he would sometimes, I've heard, you know, you never know how much is truth in myth sometimes, that apparently he would make students do 100 value scales, so 100 squares from black and white, and you would have to show how it gradually changes. We make students do 9, so much more mental. But he would say you have to crawl across a form like an ant crawls across a piece of paper. You have to, like, in each step is a different value. So you can absolutely accomplish that. Like Bouguereau, for examples used ebauche, E-B-O-U-C-H-E, and that is where you, and again, this is a generalized version of what it is, a washy rendition of everything you're seeing, full palette, everything. You're not generalizing, you're kind of going for everything, just in a very washy modeled fashion. And then in full opacity, you would then build up areas in turns to full opacity. And so that is a more direct way. So technically it's a little indirect because there is the ebauche first, but the realization, like you do go from like a wash to a finish very quickly. And in Rembrandt's later years, he actually did, and again, this is a paraphrasing because Rembrandt didn't like to paint. He didn't like to block himself into a singular method of painting. But in his later years, one of his more common ways of painting was working on a very dark canvas and basically being alla prima, and then would just do that again and again and again and again. And then eventually he would break things down to a point where everything looks smooth, but that's the result of just constantly breaking things down, never actually patting paints together, you know, and things like that. So absolutely. And even Sargent, you know, has his reputation for, but he does have these smoother passages, and that's again, pages of attempts. You know, it's even Sargent, who does have the reputation for kind of nailing things quickly, which he does do. He's brilliant. He also does struggle, and like sometimes his paintings are a novel of changes, and like if you could see through them, like through x-rays, like there would be pages of attempts. One portrait he started over 80 some odd times with a sitter. You know, so like so it didn't always, even though it looks very like rapidly put off, it's just sometimes that's the result of like so many rehearsals, essentially. So yes, you can achieve that with just direct, but with alla prima painting. But I do think that most painters historically have the trajectory of working in layers in their early years and then being more direct in their later years, because they kind of understand how to, they've gained a proficiency level that has given them the ability to do that essentially. So that would be kind of the main reason for that. And then how do you avoid having muddy colors at the same time, not going into very chromatic tones? What's the difference between muting colors with its opposite and with a gray? So this does happen. This is like something that a lot of people have to contend with. And so muddy color, honestly, is the right color in the wrong place. That's the problem with muddy color. It's not the color itself. When people have muddy color, so again, not to sound like a broken record, most of the time when I come over and that's the issue, it's a value problem. It's not a color problem. And usually when it's muddy color, it's something where a dark has been lightened too much with white. That's one of the things that I come across commonly as a diagnosis for muddy color, is that, oh, you thought this was too dark, so you lightened it, and you lightened it with white. The white has, because white is also a grayer, and so white has robbed it of its chroma, so it has dropped, and now, you know, it is now much, it's chalky or muddy, and it just stands out rather than kind of adheres to the whole. So when I'm looking to gray things down, I usually do try the complement first, because I do feel like it does give you a more sophisticated gray. You know, basically, I feel like it grays it by making a color, as opposed to by implying a gray, which is what black does. So if I take black and white and I add it to a color, it imposes its grayness on the color. Whereas if I add a green to a red, they create a new color that neutralizes red, but it is still a color. And so I think that especially when you're doing, like our students do cast paintings, when you're trying to look for color in a white object, that strategy can make all the difference between a color looking right, because you're really looking for subtle tints of gray as opposed to, like, you know, full-blown color. I think also when it comes to muddy color, so you also have to, like, and these are all blanket rules. Generally speaking, though, your light and your shadow should have different temperatures. So if your light is a warmer light, your shadow should be slightly cooler in comparison, or vice versa. If your light's cool, your shadow, should be warm, as well, just to some extent. So if you're finding like a chalkiness or a muddiness, that can also be the reason why, is that you're not acknowledging that there's a temperature difference. And if you were to cool off or warm one up, that'll kind of like shift that, and your eye will then say, oh, okay, that's a light, there's a difference there. My eye is reading a vocabulary word it didn't before, essentially.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, and also sometimes having a neutral gray mixed up and on your palette can be somewhat helpful, but I think that it's more, as usual, it's more like a way of thinking. That's the main key to that. So anybody have any more questions right now? Oh, Laura, you're welcome. Thank you.
I've got one.
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the topic of painting wet into wet paint. Wet into wet seems kind of silly because paint is wet, and that's half of it there. But to put a very precise color and shape, and perhaps a small one, not lose its chroma value, not create a blend with the wet paint, but to get it to lay there on top.
Yes.
I made a short list. I know touch is part of it, the angle of the brush, the softness of the brush itself, the paint surface you're going down on. But what are some of the principles to get that to lay there? I know Sargent said he would paint a portrait in one sitting if he could concentrate well enough. That would mean that some colors were going to go on top of others and have to be what he wanted.
Yeah, he absolutely. So he does say, he goes, you should be able to nail it in the first set, in the first session. He goes, I'm just not always that good, or something, to words to those effect. But he does, so that happens. So this happens like when students are doing things like, recently I had a student doing, she was doing this like old school Mickey Mouse hat in one of her still lifes, where it had like the cap and then these two plastic ears, and the plastic ears had these highlights on the ridges of the ears that were sharp. And when she was painting the ears where everything was wet into wet, she kept trying to make the highlights work. And what kept happening, because when wet paint meets wet paint, it wants to fuse. That's its natural tendency. So every time she tried to make a declarative mark, the paint was not letting her because she was working wet into wet. So what she had to do was let that layer dry, and then she was able to come back with just the highlight wet over dry, and then she was able to make a nice sharp declarative highlight edge. Because then it was not mixing with the fields of color that she had put down before, and that highlight could like, that note could be hit without any like background noise. So if you're dealing with something that has a lot of like graphic clarity of shapes, like, you know, it's like if you're doing like a toy train or something like that, where it has a lot of complex machinery, working wet into wet can be a little challenging, because you do need to work wet into wet in order to soften edges and etc. But if you want clear, like sharp edged moments, sometimes wet over dry can serve you better. And Sargent does that a lot in some of his works. There's and I'm forgetting her name, there's the portrait of the little girl in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she's wearing a white dress. She almost looks like the character Goldilocks. She has like golden hair, and she's standing on a red, she's holding hydrangeas, and she's like this, she's on this red rug. Anyway, it was recently at the show, and you could see that the plants and like the stem of the hydrangeas were painted on top of the background, which means they were done different days. So Sargent does implement that because he didn't want the green loose brushstroke to mix with the background, because that would contaminate it, and he wouldn't have this nice romantic loose brush mark that represents the stalk of a flower. But but he could do that if he let it dry, because then it, like, you know, as you're saying, it won't mix with what's up there already. So so if you do work wet into wet, you must work wet into wet to soften, to blend, to integrate. You have to, that's a must. But if you want to create sharpnesses, graphic moments, and clarity, it's not a necessity. Working wet over dry can actually sometimes help you in those regards. Does that help clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, I was just hoping to find any more tricks, if you will, to get the paint to lay on top of wet, when otherwise for every passage you're waiting for another drying period. And I know a lot of painters, you know, about 3 times, so the whole process has to be divided into 3 layers of stuff.
Well, you know, it's funny you mentioned that, because like, so after researching a few different types of painting processes from, you know, early Renaissance to 19th century, there is a certain magic number to 3 or 4, because even so painters of all different practices, like where it's, you know, like Leonardo, who has over, like in some of his paintings has over 30 layers of minuscule passages of paint, to someone like Sargent, who, like, as he said, if he's on his game, he can nail it in a day. You know, there's typically there's something about 4, like so with Dutch painting, for example, there's the inventing stage, which is like the dry brush stage, the dead color stage, which can mean slightly different things. It can mean either a monochrome underpainting or like a big local color lay-in kind of a thing, the working up, and then refinishing. So there were 4 stages in that generalized process. the Italian Renaissance, it's very similar. There's the pentimenti drawing stage. There's they call it something, again, it's called dead coloring. That's a very consistent term. And then it's called, and this is where it's a little different if you're like in the Venetian area versus if you're in Southern, but basically it's grasso sul magro, which is basically the fat over lean principles, kind of what, so like the building up of forms essentially. So like, again, a 3 to 4 layered process. So that does sound right though, like that, like historically speaking, many schools implement a 3 to 4 layer minimum process if they're working in layers, that is. But in terms of getting your like more paint to stick, I think that the couple things I would think about would be what type of brush you're using. Because if you're using a bristle brush, that can actually like, it doesn't lay the paint down as evenly as like a softer brush does, which tends to lay the paint down. Bristle brushes lift up as well as put down. So they're great for like dead coloring early stages, but they're not super fantastic for later stages. So the type of brush you're using, you can also be thinking about different types of mediums, because if it sounds like you're partially maybe having issues with adherence, where like the paint being pulled off your brush is what there's an issue. So what I would suggest is maybe trying a little bit of stand oil with your, like, so when you're working with your paint, if you oil in an area to work into, I might suggest using a hybrid of 50% linseed oil and 50% stand oil. Stand oil is linseed oil that's been heated, and its properties are that it's basically slower drying and it's thicker. So painters will use it if they're working on a panel where there's no tooth, because it acts like a tooth. It kind of it gives you friction and it pulls your paint off the brush. So that could be something else to consider experimenting with to help the paint adhere for a longer period, working wet into wet.
So that would be for the layer that's going on top, or the one?
Yes. Yeah. So that would be going on top. Yeah.
What can be done to make the original paint stickier? So perhaps within one session, but it could last, a few hours of painting, but still, by definition, you're painting wet into wet, but make it to where it'll not dry, but maybe set up to where it's somewhat more receptive. Is there an angle there?
So like, in other words, like kind of like to have the drying maybe almost like encourage it so that it kind of happens a little quicker so you can work on it again.
With that same day,
Yeah. So
put some touches on it later in the session, because your first layer is becoming a little sticky and
sure. So you could definitely, so that's where you certainly could experiment with dryers. There are a number of dryers out there that can help assist you in that, such as like, so first of all, if you use lead white, that'll expedite your drying. There's, so natural pigments they're very, I say health conscious, which they are, but they're health conscious of meaning like archival safety of the painting. So I would trust their dryers. They do make a dryer that I use for my workshops, which is called pale drying oil. And it's just linseed oil that has, just like some very basic additives to it. And basically the paintings dry, it's overnight. So it's maybe not the same day, but practically. And if you were able to kind of put it in a warm area, that plus a dryer, that'll expedite it, even a little bit further. There are also oil paints that Winsor & Newton makes with alkyd medium mixed in with them already, and those dry very, very quickly. So those can also be things that you can add. Like I know Julie has added some of those to her paints when something is more time specific or there's a deadline.
Right, a Griffin paint.
Yes, Griffin paint. That's what it's called. I'm like, there's a special name for it, but I couldn't remember it exactly. Yep.
Yeah, I've done that for plein air for that very reason.
Yeah, exactly. So like that would be a perfect, because there's, there's kind of a sense of urgency when you're out there. It's kind of like, I've got to get this right now.
Or if you only use Griffin white, because it seems to get into so many mixtures anyway.
Right, exactly. So just by using the white can be very helpful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Julie, I see your hand up. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for
Good.
hosting this. Let me
Of course, of course.
lower my hand.
Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, so I was sick the last two art history lectures.
Oh no,
but
okay.
I did watch the Rembrandt one.
Oh yeah.
One. I finally finished watching it. And one thing that you talked about a lot was kind of this glowing effect that they achieve, kind of in parts that are light and like in certain areas of the skin, there's just like glowing effect.
Yeah.
And so you talked about kind of the layering that they do with lead white, and glazes over that. And so I guess as somebody who does not want to use lead white in my tiny apartment, and you know, I'm weird
That's
about the toxic pigments.
Yep.
Is there just like no hope for achieving
No.
that glowing? Or can you talk a little bit about that? That's my first question. And then my second question is, a lot of times in art history, and today you've talked about kind of the story and the narrative in paintings and how you can use composition to like get across a message.
Yeah.
So do you ever, I guess, is there any value in just like making a painting that doesn't have any sort of heady purpose? It's just, I like what that looks like and I want it to look like that. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Great. Yep, absolutely. So there is, so first of all, there is hope for non-lead users. So that it's just that's just lead is inherently transparent. So it basically what happens because whenever oil is transparent, even semi-transparent, the light that is hitting the painting is actually passing through the layers and it's illuminating the painting from within as well as the surface. And that's what will give a painting a glowing effect. And that can be achieved with titanium. And in fact, one of the whites I use, so I use the titanium I do use is Gamblin flake white replacement, which I know if you've been at our school, you know that we like that one the most. It darkens the least after drying and it's fairly affordable. So that one, I'll thin a little bit with oil. And then I'll add a little bit of stand oil to it actually, because out of the tube, it's actually very sticky and very gummy. And I don't really like the texture. But after I add a little bit of stand oil to it, it's actually quite a nice texture. You can, in my experience, you can actually get close to mimicking lead with that. And you can, you can really even add a little bit more stand oil if you want to imitate more of a transparency to it. Like, so that's not something that's like an absolute. And natural pigments now, I think they even have they have a lot more whites now. They even have like safer options, I think, like a titanium and lead mix and stuff like that. So even if you have no ambitions for very good reasons of not using lead, that's not going to be kind of like an unachievable, like a barrier that will not be able to break through. I mean, like there are many painters that out, who do wonderful. I mean, like Daniel Sprick uses titanium white, he's able to achieve beautiful luminous effects. So it's and a lot of transparent passages as well. So it's really not like an essential. It's just that was a consistency in all their work, partially because lead was the only option at the time, and titanium really didn't come around until the advent of the 19th century. So yes, you can be team titanium and still succeed at oil painting. So you're oh shoot, what was your second question? I'm sorry,
My second question, no, thank you so much. That's helpful to know about the titanium stuff. My second question was about kind of the purpose of storytelling in paintings and the opposite of that, and whether that is just like anti-art, or I'm curious if there are any kind of greats that you admire that don't have all this kind of weighty. I know historically it was like a lot of religious stories and it, anyway. So
basically, like in this question does come up in the lecture. Somebody does ask this because I'm pointing things out through the lecture, and somebody does ask so how much were they aware? Like how much of this is conscious? Like, oh, I'm putting this here because of blah, 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 blah. and it's hard to know, but there are certain, and I kind of, it's, you know, I have some visual examples in the lecture that you can see that'll kind of explain why, but it's there are some things that you can tell, like, okay, that's a little too coincidental to be like accidental. But in the end, all of these complex things. So the couple things that you're going to hear me talk about in that lecture is gridding, using a grid, using an armature, rebatment, diagonals, these different kind of compositional elements. All of that boils down to one simple question, though, which is, does that look right? Do I like that? And that's really the main instinct a painter has to work with. So there is complete validity to, I'm just like, you know, I'm just making a painting. I'm not going to predetermine the image so heavily. Lucian Freud was that kind of painter. You know, really just kind of started, worked out. And I know Lucian Freud not be everyone's benchmark of great figurative painting. I think he was a genius. I love his work. I think he's fantastic. So that's why I'm using him. But he's somebody who wouldn't be like Alma Tadema, because, you know, because he actually would be allergic to that, because he said that he hates the clever in art. Freud, that is. So yeah, so like, no, not everything has to be this Da Vinci Code-esque kind of complex subliminal messaging. And often it isn't. It's really just like many things, it's often a few simple principles that are kind of exploited, really. And there's one example you're going to see that actually at the end, after introducing like different elements, we then look at two paintings with all of them in it. And two of them are Jerome paintings. And the Jerome paintings, you actually see he uses the same template in two different paintings. It's almost like Disney reusing their animation in two different films. You literally see the same composition wearing a different costume. So it's you know, it could be as formulaic like that as you want it. It could also be just as organic and free forming, like Titian. Titian made changes on the fly for composition, not staying wed to a predetermined cartoon, which was why he was so radical for that time period, because that was very much like, you know, Raphael. You draw everything out, you transfer it, and then you kind of color it in with paint. So there's a broad spectrum. And I think that honestly, really the main question that you have to all of that, it's like kind of like a reverse tree diagram. All of those complex things funnel to one question is, do I like that? And that's really partially a hard thing to answer, because that's very individual. So some person A might say, I love it. And person B might be like, nah, not for me. So.
Thanks so much, Gary.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so we have a few more questions I see here, and then we'll wrap. So here we have, let me see here. Borna, a question about wet under eye. In the terms of durability of painting over time, how do oil applies to a thicker layer underneath? I mean, which molecules are responsible for oil becoming one part of the previous layer? So, you know, this actually is something that we're like, getting new information about recently. We're actually talking to Eric Johnson, our online instructor, that what they're finding now is that lead itself actually benefits, and its benefits are now like, basically, if you have lead in just one layer of a painting, its benefits are going to be seen and felt through other layers. That somehow lead is able to kind of like, in a good way, pass on its positive attributes to other layers of paint. Yeah, I know, Julie. Another reason that lead, but again, it's not. It's just that like that's where that's just where like they're getting that. Like Eric was just talking to me about this now, that like even in those layers, like that's really like that can be affected. But when I was looking into Raphael's painting method, he violates grasso son magro regularly, or fat over lean, because he would use ground glass as a medium. And so he really wasn't following a very strict fat over lean or slower drying over faster drying trajectory that we all do now. So I think that when it comes to kind of thinking in terms of like the wet over dry, and there's whatever, like, so whenever you're working on a painting, there are 2 or 3 things that if you follow, you should be in the all clear. One is you want to see how your painting has dried. Sometimes your painting will dry and it'll dry shiny or glossy. That's not great, even though it looks great because it's not sunken in. It's a problem because it's basically varnished at that point. And if you put a new layer on top, it's not going to bind properly because that layer's been sealed. So what you'll have to do if you do come in and it's dry and shiny, you have to take mineral spirits on a sponge or on a bristle brush and abrase the surface. And what that's going to do is dissolve that skin, not the paint layer, just the skin that's been formed. That shine will go away, your painting will sink in, but it'll be more receptive to binding. So that's one thing. Second, if it's not shiny but dry, you want to make sure it's hard dry, not dry to the touch. Those are different things. Dry to the touch is what it sounds like. If I put my finger on it and lift up, nothing comes off. But that's not the same as a hard dry. A hard dry is if I bend my finger, I take my bent finger and I apply a little bit of pressure and I rub to agitate the surface. And then I'll look, and then if no paint comes off, that's a hard dry. And I know that then I'm much more in the clear to work on top of it. Dry to the touch is a little misleading because it can be dry like this, but then you oil in and that friction reactivates that skin. And then it's really not a hard dry. And that's when you can run into problems. The other thing is like, if you're unsure, in terms of, so don't think of things over fat over lean I don't think of it that way because I think people get blocked into this thinking of mineral spirits in the early stages, oil in the later stages. And that's not true. You can use oil in the first layers. It just has to be faster drying. So if you're using like raw umber and lead white with linseed oil in the first layer, that's okay because the raw umber dries super quick. Lead white dries super quick. It's the first layer. The surface is going to absorb a lot of that oil. So that's okay. You just, as you go on, you just want to almost always be adding like a little bit of either stand oil or just as like and I mean drops, or linseed oil, just as an insurance policy that you're going slower, drier as you continue. But that, just mild though. Don't add medium or oil if you don't know why you're doing it. That's a huge thing about mediums in general. If you don't know why you're adding it, don't add it, period, because mediums just complicate things. But I would say check for a shine, deal with it if there is one, then check if it's a hard dry and only paint if it's on a hard dry surface. If you follow those couple things, I think you'll find that you can manage the drawing time. It'll just work out much better for you. But I would also advise to think of the construction of a painting as slower drying on top of faster drying, instead of fat over lean, because that's not untrue. It's just very limited in thinking, essentially. Okay, and so let's see. Okay, so last question here. Oh, last 2 questions. I'm sorry. So Dale is asking, I'm planning painting on self-portrait for the summer of 20 by 24. What are some guidelines, advice for setting up a self-portrait? So setting up a self-portrait can be really difficult. Self-portraits are a great way to kind of push your abilities because you're the model. So if you move, the model moves. So it's a little tough. But that's also why, like, a couple things that I would say about setting up a self-portrait. Don't choose a complicated pose. It's going to be hard enough as it is. A lot of people try to like make it different, like, make it interesting. And it's like, right, but you have to remember the light has to hit your painting surface, your palette, and you. So you're limited. In your mirror, I would tape in some marks for like the bottom of your chin and where the top of your head is. So that way, when you're stepping back and forth, you can kind of close one eye and lock yourself back in each time. I would recommend wearing dark clothing so that your shirt does not impose color or value onto your surface or onto the underside of your face, unless you want a little bit of a light note up here for, unless you have some purpose for that. A single light source, I would say, would be good as opposed to having dual, because again, it's just easier overall. And what would be another thing? The other thing I would say is don't go too big. So portraits, portraits and like just don't go too big. Like life size, I think would be too large, especially for head and shoulder portraits. If you're doing just head and shoulders, life size is way too large. You should be like, you know, maybe half life size. Just because when they're head and shoulders, people walk, they invite people up to be looked at. So if you have a huge head with that format, it doesn't really work. So that would be just kind of go smaller, make it more easel size. But otherwise it's really just really challenging because you can't really measure because you'll see your hands reflection. You can't use a mirror because the model will change. But so single light source, simple pose, dark clothing, tape marks for positioning, and maybe a plumb line. And don't go too big. Those would be kind of just some general guidelines that will kind of just take some variables out that I've seen that can trip people up along that process. But self-portraits are they're very good to do. They can also just be, very difficult to do at the same time. Okay, and so let's see here. So Myra again says, do you have some recommendations on books about painting techniques? What are your favorite artists or the ones you have most influenced your work, by the way? So actually, when it comes to books, there are a couple I can think of that are very helpful, although some of them are a little difficult to read because of when they were written. So there's a book by Charles Eastlake, and I think it's a generic title called like the Science and Methods or Oil Painting Practices of Old Masters. He was the first curator for the National Gallery in London. And it's a very thorough, very informative book on different painting methods throughout history. But the English he's using is a form of English it's a little hard to read because he says to start with the carnations of the flesh, and that means to start with the reds because carnations are red. So there are some moments like that where it's English, but it's a little hard to understand at times exactly what is being meant. What I find to be the most valuable, whenever museums or public collections do cleanings of paintings, they do have to then publish a technical review of what was found. And sometimes they're a little bit of a slog to get through because there's a lot of technical terms, but they do outline the process that the painting was painted. And so they're a bit of an esoteric resource, but I actually find that those are more helpful. The more recent ones are better, of course, just because our conservation methods have only gotten better with time, and we're no longer using, well, mostly not as harmful techniques. So actually the technical reviews that are posted by museums and curators after they clean paintings are immensely helpful resources, as well as books. Solomon J. Solomon's book on painting is also very helpful. I've been mentioning Harold Speed all through here. There is a book that if your particular interest is on academic painting, there's a rare book that is it is rare. It's a little expensive, a little harder to find, but you can find it. And I believe it's called, this is where all these titles are so similar. It's kind of like The Art and History of French Academic Painting, I think. And the author's name is Albert, and then I think the last name starts with a B. I think it's Blah. Let me just look that up very, very quickly. But I think it's like, yeah, I'm forgetting the name. I totally forget that. I think it's oh man, I'm trying to remember the name. But it'll come to. I can send that in an email, I guess, or something once it comes back to me. But but honestly, the thing I read a lot it's kind of like a newspaper, technical bulletins that are posted.
Albert Boehm.
Boehm, yes, that's it. Albert Boehm, B-O-I-M-E. Albert Boehm. The technical payoff is early in the book. He does go through the academic process very articulately within the first few chapters of the book. So that's a very good resource. Amazing book, a little hard to find. But those are my main recommendations. No problem. Well, thank you all very much for joining me today. I know we are at time, so I'm going to have to land the plane. But please feel free to check out my composition lecture should be coming out soon. Thank you all for your questions, and I hope I was able to kind of answer some and reveal some things for you. Be well, and I will talk to you all very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks.